When you hear about a religion that doesn't let you have sex, it feels kind of old hat. Like, yeah, I've heard that one before. But when you hear about a religion where they make beautiful chairs and baskets, and they don't let anyone have sex, even if they're married, then I start to get intrigued. We are talking about the Shakers, the religion/intentional community/woodworker extraordinaires. You might have heard rumblings or shakings about them recently because they probably hit their first cultural apex in this century. The Testament of Anne Lee is a new movie about the founder's life from her birth in Manchester, England to her death in New York State. And if you didn't see that, no biggie. Just check your mail, because the Shakers got a set of USPS stamps titled Shaker Design. And that's usually what the Shakers are most famous for, their design. Their dressers, their chairs, their baskets, their weaving, their boxes, their little peg hooks on the wall. Now to some, these might just look like old furniture. But they're not as old as they look or as they seem. Not to be a simp for simple design, but I'm going to try and make you fall in love with a chest of drawers. Let me introduce you to a little number called Case of Drawers, circa 1825 to 1850. These are from New Lebanon, New York, often referred to as the first official Shaker community. Now you might say, yeah, Kendra, I've seen drawers before. To which I would respond, why are you being so standoffish? Let me just explain the drawers to you. Not one of the drawers is the same size as the one before it. The smallest is 1 inch high, the largest is 3 inches, and from the top to bottom they slowly expand, like a gradient but for drawers. This was probably used as storage for physicians, and at some point it was probably a built-in cabinet into the wall, and then over time was removed. The drawers have partitions inside of them, which wouldn't necessarily explain why it was for doctors, but we know that because of the names written inside the drawers. The first is Dr. Barnabas Hinckley. The rest are less fun, but also at some point acted as physicians or herbalists at Mount Lebanon. Now, I have never built a chest of drawers, and unless the algorithm really changes, I don't think I ever will. But you can just tell this is hard work. The amount of math and thinking and time this would take is astounding. And it visually looks very different from the rest of the furniture being built at the time in the non-Shaker world. And to prove that, let's go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art's website. We can filter their collection from the time period as 1825 to 1850, the location as the United States, and the category being furniture. And let's see what others were up to in the United States furniture game. Yeah, so the Shaker set of drawers is clearly a bit of an anomaly. These do not look like the rest of the furniture happening in the US in the 1800s. Anytime you see something that looks similar, you read below it and it says, United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, Shakers. Yeah, I did forget to tell you guys that that is the long name for the Shakers. They believe Christ would come again. Anne Lee was relaying messages to the church. One of her revelations was sex was the original sin, and by abstaining, you could just pretty quickly avoid the whole human sin element of life. They were millennialists, which in this case doesn't mean like tight jeans and big flannels. Millennialists believed that the end of the world was near, and they would need to live free of sin for upcoming judgment to live in future eternity. That might not be the most perfect definition, but keep in mind, I am merely a millennial, not a millennialist. But the reason I showed you all that furniture is because I wanted to bring up the time period. The Anne Lee came to New York City in 1774, but that isn't when most of the Shaker furniture you see in museums and books is from. The majority is from the mid-1800s. This book of 114 objects from the Shakers, that includes our chest of drawers, accompanied the exhibition at the Whitney Museum of American Art in 1986. Not one of the pieces included was created before the 1800s. And in the introduction, June Sprigg, the curator and former college student who lived with the Shakers for 3 summers, explains why that might be. Above all, Shaker life freed believers from the whimsical, merciless prison called style. They did not care what the world considered fashionable. The first believers, of course, knew about worldly style when they entered Shaker life. It is no accident that the best, purest examples of Shaker design date from the second quarter of the 19th century, when the first generation of Shaker children reached their prime active years. Shakers such as David and Orrin did not so much create a new design as endlessly refine an inherited one. As worldly taste grew increasingly ornate in the mid-19th century, the difference between the Shaker and worldly homes became more pronounced. She goes on to point out examples of writers, contemporaries of this furniture, finding it old-fashioned. And one of those was Charles Dickens, who really only had one word to describe it. We walked into the grim room where several grim hats were hanging on grim pegs, and the time was grimly told by a grim clock which uttered every tick with a kind of struggle, as if it broke the grim silence reluctantly and under protest. Ranged against the walls were 6 or 8 stiff high-backed chairs, and they partook so strongly of this general grimness that one would much rather have sat on the floor than incurred the smallest obligation to any of them. As you can imagine, this is not the only complaint he had in this chapter. But we don't really need to hear a man who's been dead for 150 years say that an elderly woman reminded him of a leather bag. Instead, let's have him disparage some elderly buildings. On the opposite side of the road was their place of worship, a cool, clean edifice of wood with large windows and green blinds, with a spacious summer house. As there was no getting into this place, and nothing was to be done but walk up and down, and look at it and the other buildings in the village, which were chiefly of wood painted a dark red like English barns, and composed of many stories like English factories, I have nothing to communicate to the reader beyond the scanty results I gleaned while our purchases were making. Charles Dickens was visiting the Shaker village in New Lebanon, and because it was 1842, there is a map that can help us envision what he saw. This one is from 1839, and you'll notice these clusters of buildings, although, honestly, they are just rectangles on a piece of paper. It was this location that inspired many Shaker villages across New England. Inspired might not even be the best word for it. More, it was the blueprint. For example, in 1786, a meetinghouse was built in New Lebanon. The meetinghouse is what Charles Dickens referred to as their place of worship, which is what it was. That original meetinghouse in New Lebanon is gone now, but there were 7 other meetinghouses built on 7 other Shaker villages by those same Shaker builders across New England, which is a really good thing when you're looking for surviving examples. Of the 7, only 2 still exist. And the one that hasn't been moved or modified greatly is at the Shaker Village in Canterbury, New Hampshire. The roof is a gambrel, which I realize we haven't really covered much in all of our roof talks over the years. You'll see it on Dutch colonials or houses that want you to think about Dutch colonials. Like a mansard, the roof line is so upright that it allows for additional usable space in the roof, without looking particularly big from the outside. Although it looks like a 1-story from this view, inside it holds 2.5 stories, with 1.5 of those stories happening in the roof. The 2 doors on the long walls welcome men and women separately, and despite all that separation, they actually do worship together. Charles Dickens wasn't able to see the inside of the meeting house. In consequence of certain unseemly interruptions which their worship had received from strangers, their chapel was closed to the public for the space of 1 year. I don't know what that incident might have been, but the Shakers were becoming popular again. Initially, from 1776 to 1794, 11 Shaker villages were established across New England, and then a second bout of villages were established beyond New England in Ohio and Kentucky in the early 1800s. The population was at its peak in 1850 with around 5,000 members across 18 communities. Now let's keep in mind that there weren't internal factors that were making their populations grow. No Shaker was having kids. The place only grew when people joined, sometimes adults, families, but often children. Children with no parents or parents who could not afford to feed them. The majority of children would leave the Shakers when they came of age, but enough stayed. Along with that, in the mid-1800s, there was also this fascination with utopias and this idea of standalone civilizations. Lots of people were starting their own, and they were doing it much less successfully than the Shakers. You've got Louisa May Alcott's dad starting Fruitlands in 1843. They were vegan and also would only eat fruits and vegetables that were growing upwards. And in 1848, Oneida, who lived a communal lifestyle, but instead of no sex, they were like, whoa, sex. In that community, being monogamous was frowned upon. You've got an attempt at a community built around octagon-shaped houses in Kansas in 1856 called Octagon City. There were no houses built when they got there, and none were built when they left. 2 out of the 3 utopias that I described didn't even last a year. Oneida being the exception, which made it 33 years and ended up becoming a silverware company. Shakers, on the other hand, were around since the 1780s, and they had what other utopian attempts didn't have: decades of surviving winters under their belt. They had buildings, multiple locations, multiple businesses, but to writers and tourists and travelers, they were just a novelty, a place to visit, but not to make a life. Charles Dickens's final opinions on the Shakers was not particularly positive, leaving the Shaker village with a hearty dislike of the old Shakers and a hearty pity for the young ones. And although he did give them compliments, they are good farmers and their produce is eagerly purchased and highly esteemed. He also had big reservations. He might have playfully disparaged the chairs and the decor with his grim repetition, but he was disturbed more by children being raised here under such strict rules, fearing they wouldn't have the strength to leave. I so abhor and from my soul detest that bad spirit, no matter by what class or sect it may be entertained, which would strip life of its healthful graces, rob youth of its innocent pleasures, pluck from maturity and age their pleasant ornaments, and make existence but a narrow path towards the grave. It's funny he uses narrow path here, because I was reading about the Shakers somewhat wistfully until I got to this chapter called Proper Path in Shaker Life, Art, and Architecture from Scott T. Swank. He was the museum director of Canterbury Shaker Village for decades. At this point, everything I had read really focused on simplicity, creativity, industry, free time. And here I finally met the words that made me bristle: the rules. Neither outsiders nor members of the Shaker community could circulate freely between buildings. A person in an inappropriate place would be noticed quickly. Many interior and nearly all exterior doors had locks, restricting free movement. The survival of an impressive range of keys at Canterbury testifies to the fact that although village security was surely a major concern, control of unwanted access from within the community may have been just as important. And then he goes on to talk about kind of the movement within the village. The purposeful circulation pattern insulated each Shaker at several levels. It isolated non-Shakers from the Shaker community, separated the Shakers by gender, segregated the ministry from the brothers and sisters, and guarded against unintentional encounters by business visitors and hired men with Shaker children and members of the community. The Shakers were not deliberately trying to be secretive or mysterious. In the church family plan, the visible pattern of solids, roads, paths, and buildings, and voids, dooryards, gardens, was overlaid with an invisible pattern of implied boundaries that were observed by knowledge and discipline. These symbolic boundaries were hardly cloistered walls with locked gates. Rather, they were subtle and often invisible reminders of internal discipline. I can now kind of see why that concern for this narrow path towards the grave came up, and it somehow makes more sense coming from Charles Dickens. At 12, his life changed completely when his family, including his 7 siblings, were sent to debtor's prison for his father's debt. As the eldest son, Charles Dickens had to work in a factory to pay it off. His writing helped draw attention and public scrutiny to debtor's prisons. But when he's in the Shaker village, he mentions the buildings looking a bit like wooden multi-story English factories. That's something I find interesting here. Although born 75 years apart, 250 miles away, both Charles Dickens and Anne Lee were born in England to a life of child labor. Anne Lee was born in Manchester, England in 1736. She worked in a cotton factory as a child and never learned how to write. Anne Lee would have been a child laborer spinning cotton that would have been grown on plantations in America, and the fabrics produced in Manchester were then directly traded to kidnap and enslave Africans. By being born working class in Manchester, she was employed by a trading post on the transatlantic slave trade. And this is all pre-industrialization, before large imposing mill buildings could become the setting of a Charles Dickens story. People have often analyzed the writing of Charles Dickens as it related to his childhood, and it's not a particularly complex connection. Many of his famous works revolve around children and young people being abandoned or burdened with too much responsibility. Oliver Twist, Little Dorrit, David Copperfield, relying on kindness and luck and smarts. Far less analysis has been done for Anne Lee, and usually it's as basic as she hated sex, therefore she created a religion that had none. So now I will try my hand at a little analysis as well. If we think about her life, she, just like Charles Dickens, was the second eldest of 8 children. With minimal choice, she worked just like everyone else around her. And by building a religion against sex and procreation, she took away that involuntary buy-in for future generations. And from there, she created this separate, insulated community, where money is for the community, furniture and cooking is made to be shared, to be used. It feels like an attempt to remove oneself from that entire economy that you were born into, that you could not volunteer for. Yes, you are still engaged in labor. She's quoted with many lines about the importance in taking care in one's work. But the entire enterprise is much smaller. It's about sustaining food and shelter and your personal community. You might think that the religion that would come from this origin would have nothing in common with factories and labor. But what made this community survive is that it did. When Scott Swank tries to explain the architectural design, he compares the community to a machine. The sparseness of the Shakers' exteriors belies the innovative manipulation of their interior space. Within their buildings, the Shakers developed an intensive use of all available space, organized it into distinctive Shaker patterns, and differentiated it according to gender and function. The result was a system of Shaker interior design marked by such features as dual-entried and staircases, a profusion of storage units, and a repetition of Shaker peg rail. This system, which has no direct vernacular or academic sources, is one of the Shakers' most important contributions to the history of design. What most previous writers have failed to appreciate is that Shaker interior design expresses an industrial aesthetic of spare efficiency and potential replication. Shaker interiors are a successful application of industrial ideas to architectural design. He believes that many historians may be belaboring the connection between Shakers and simplicity. An early Shaker historian and collector, Edward Demings Andrew, wrote many books, including Religion in Wood, a book of Shaker furniture, where he connects religious piety to the design choices. The exhibit where I found that lovely chest also calls out simplicity. But Scott Swank questioned this simple rhetoric as a bit of a oversimplification. Shaker design cannot be fully understood in the 20th century stylistic terms because it is primarily an expression of the larger social structure of Shaker order. Life and community, lived according to a code of rules, is relatively obscure and alien concept today, as we value individual creative expression and achievement. The Shakers, as millennialists, with a belief in progressive revelation, were committed to community rule in their specially designed environment, in which they could perform a wide range of activities and ritual acts that were designed to accentuate their solidarity and de-emphasize the individual. He goes into it further in a later chapter. The goal of the Shaker community living was to free the individual from worldly concerns and minutiae of daily decision-making. This freedom, the Shakers believed, would improve production, diminish human frictions, and liberate the spirit for pure thought and dedicated worship. The less thought invested in decisions like when to get up, what to wear, what work to do, what to eat, how to make a living, and how to behave, the more productive and spiritual one could be. And that theory on time also meant the Shakers were pretty pro-technology. Efficiency means more time to devote to worship. The Canterbury Shakers bought a car in 1907. Here they built a room of batteries powered by a generator 15 years before AC power was run to the village. Here you can see a KitchenAid plugged into the wall with all its attachments, or poplar wood being stripped via machine for weaving. That might be why simplicity feels like the wrong term. Simple living, as we think of it, usually butts heads with technology. But we can look at photos they took of themselves and their telephones and generators and radios and printing presses and see that they were engaged with the future. I mentioned photos they took of themselves because of this book called A Shaker Family Album. By the 1920s, a great many of the Shakers who resided in Canterbury were taking pictures, and this was done first with Brownie cameras and later with Eastman Kodaks. And what I liked most about these photos is they tore me away from that grim that Charles Dickens had described. Some of the photos look posed, the elders seated specifically in a room, or older photos taken by studios standing outside a building posed like so many Victorian photographs of the time. But then you get some of these semi-posed photos that look like everyone was gathered and eating and someone said, "Oh, let me take a photo of this." Apple picking from 1918 with what looks like smiles and laughs. Some jokes like Dewey the dog playing the piano. A snowstorm from 1922 where women are holding hands and smiling, and next to that photo, probably from the same snowstorm, a giant snowball entitled Our Work. And unlike every photo on this page where people are smiling and laughing, this one seems to be poking a little fun at how they are seen. A stern expression, some might call it grim, good posture. This is how the world sees them, but every photo surrounding it is smiles and sled rides. Narratively, this is where I should stop showing photos, but when you find something this good, you have to show it, even if it relates to nothing. This photo is from Easter 1932 with a band of bunnies playing musical instruments on the steps of the dwelling house. Let the creators of Silent Hill know we've got some new horror models for the next game. Now I want to look back at that chest of drawers, so we can ooh and ah, but also so we can take a closer look at those inscriptions. One says, H.C., amusing himself sortin' tax, April 15, 1916. An idle mind is the devil's worship. Yeah. I probably added my own intonation that was not in the original writing, but here we're seeing this playful relationship to the industriousness of Shakers. It was Henry Clough who wrote the name of the physicians listed out in April of 1916. This was Henry recording all the past drawer users. But by writing these down, we can actually follow some of the stories of these men. And it follows what we learned earlier about children joining the Shakers. Barnabas was admitted to the Shaker community at 12, James joined at 10, Joseph joined at 9, Henry Clough, the man with the beautiful penmanship, was born later than the rest of this group and was in the community at the age of 2. But Henry's story isn't quite like the rest of these men. At 28, he left the Shakers. He moved, started a business and a family with another former Shaker. But another line on another dresser drawer might give us a hint at what happened next. Our lips mumble the phrases of a bygone Shakerism, but our hearts dwell in the camp of hypocrite. At first, that made no sense to me. I don't speak 100-year-old Shaker proverbs. But this isn't actually a proverb. Our lips mumble the phrases of a bygone Shakerism. We are speaking the language and customs of Shakers, which seem to be on the way out. And the second half, but our hearts dwell in the camp of hypocrite. Our behavior or belief is hypocritical. The actions don't line up with the moral teachings. He wrote that at 54 years old, but we already said he left at 28. That's right, he came back in 1909. His family moved back to a separate house. His heart might have been a hypocrite because he still lived the Shaker way while being married. At a previous point in Shaker history, this reunion would not have been accepted. But the Shaker population was declining and men were in small numbers. Henry ran the herbal business, which he had trained in as a young man. The way he writes bygone Shakerism makes me think that the writing was on the wall for Shakers, not just in this drawer. And through his lifetime, Henry Clough would have seen the peak of the Shaker population and then its steady decline, a decline he was part of. At the beginning of this video, we heard this idea of Shakers being separated from style, and their furniture being most pure from the mid-1800s because it was generations away from society and style. But considering the mid-1800s was also their most successful time as a community, it makes you wonder if it really was their distance from society or instead their success within it. Their businesses were booming, their populations were growing. They sold food and milk and herbs and household goods. They were not this closed-off entity. They might have been closed off socially, but economically, they were built in. When you look from afar to what happened to these Shaker communities, it almost feels like a result of the Industrial Revolution versus a specific indictment on their religion or beliefs. Consumer goods became shockingly cheap, and transportation meant you could get products from anywhere. Your former customers can get things for so much less than you can afford to make them. People start leaving. As the population goes down, more pressure is put on the ones who remain. When I titled this video, I wanted you to think that the drawback was that there was no sex. And I do believe that's a pretty big drawback. I also hate being told what to do, so that brings me to 2 big drawbacks for me. But the bigger overarching drawback is that there is no such thing as escaping external factors. Despite calling outsiders the world, Shakers were still part of the world. They were affected by factors outside of themselves. As people are interested in intentional communities today, it's helpful to see the cycles that the Shakers went through, that they were still affected by industrialization and the environment. And maybe we've misconstrued what simple living means. It's not simple to grow your own food or have a creamery or build a chest of drawers. That is all actually really hard work. But the simple part, the part that drew people to Shakers, was knowing you would be taken care of. Knowing that there were meals every day, a place to sleep at night, a built-in social life, access to free time. Important things you don't have to think about. And whenever we see this bubbling up of interest in communities like this, it's good to ask why people might be willing to give up their current lives to access the basic tenets of staying alive. The Shaker life isn't so simple, and I would not choose it for myself, but they have some really appealing elements. I like that they ate meals at a big long table. I like that they believed in equality. I like that they were welcoming to all. I like that they had a grim vibe in public but smiled and laughed in private. I like that they could make a nice basket and a good set of drawers. Now, you can go to a Shaker village if you're interested. There are museums across the eastern US. This month, for my Patreon video, I will be talking about the Testament of Anne Lee and what I thought about it, since it was the inspiration to actually follow through and make a video about the Shakers. I also talked about it with my friend Ken on our podcast, 2 Degrees of Ken. Last February, I made a video about the movie The Notebook and the US's obsession with colonial revivals. It's one of my favorite videos, and I made it for Valentine's Day, so it's like seasonally appropriate again. Please subscribe if you don't, and thank you all for watching. Bye!